Welcome to today's RSVP DG event, How to Get Published in an Academic Journal. My name is Victorian Bartness, and I'm one of the RSVP's Graduate Representatives. I'm co-chairing today's session with Gillian Walters, also a Graduate Representative. We are so glad that you're here. We are pleased to share that this DG event reached over 100 registrations, which is the highest we had this term. That level of interest shows how much our community values open conversations about scholarly publishing and a need for clear guidance for graduate students and early career researchers. Before we begin, a quick note that this session will be recorded for those who couldn't join us live. Today's session is part of the RSVP's Fall Pro D series. Our aim is to walk through the major stages of the publishing process, from writing and revising an article, to preparing it for submission, navigating peer review, and understanding what happens between acceptance and publication. The goal is to make this process more transparent and less intimidating. We are joined today by three editors who bring experience from different corners of Victorian studies publishing. Yvonne Garofalo is editor of Victorian poetry and assistant professor of literature at UC San Diego. Her book project, Wars and Men, 19th Century Poetry and Cosmologies of the Human, is in the final stages of preparation. Portions of the book and related work have appeared in Diacritics, Victorian Literature and Culture, European Romantic Review, and the Cambridge Companion to Romanticism and Race, among other venues. She is co-editor with Nathan Hensley of the Barbara Johnson Collective, forthcoming from Northwestern UP in fall 2026. Catherine Malone is the editor of Victorian Periodicals Review and associate professor of 19th century British literature at South Dakota State University. Her research focuses on periodical spaces and the dynamics of gender and genre. She has published on Victorian women literary critics and the genre of the recurring column, and she is currently exploring the Victorian craze for roller skating. Janice Schroeder is professor and chair of English at Carleton University and the editor of Victorian Review. She is co-editor of Ordinary Oralities, Everyday Voices in History in 2023. Together with Barbara Leckie, she co-edited an edition of Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor for Broadview Press. Her research has appeared in Women's Writing, 19th Century Gender Studies, 19th Century Context, Victorian Periodicals Review, Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature, and Adoption and Culture. We'll start with short remarks from each editor. After that, we'll move into a moderated Q&A. You are welcome to add questions to the chat at any point. So, Devon, we'll begin with you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much to everyone for being here today. I'm going to keep time in mind. I have a series of things to say, and so I will try to cover them all. And then if you have questions to follow up, right, if there's anything you want me to expand upon, I'm very happy to do that. Let me just get my window fixed. Okay, great. So I'm going to start off by talking about the process by which you sort of begin write an article for publication, preparing an article for publication, and highlighting some things that the three of us think are particularly important in the context of that process. Some of these remarks are geared toward also helping you think about how to do this with a graduate seminar paper, right? Because this is like one of the things theoretically that a graduate seminar helps you to do is to sort of like produce an essay that's potentially publishable. But there are still some significant differences between a grad seminar paper and a publishable article. So perhaps the most critical distinction to keep in mind as you begin revising an article-length essay written in the context of a graduate seminar is that graduate seminars are often designed to sort of facilitate the production of a viably publishable essay, right? But one of the most important things to do when you're revising is to ensure you've thought really carefully about your primary and secondary source archives, your research question. I'll say a little bit more about this, or the kind of problem posing that you're doing in the essay as it relates to the journal to which you want to submit. sharpening, really honing your argument, and also similarly, really defining the scope and the specificity of your interventions. And so, really key here in terms of this kind of a revision process. This also goes for a dissertation chapter too, right? Where you have this whole kind of like developing book length apparatus around a chapter that your readers can't necessarily always see. What might seem self-evident to you in the context of like a graduate seminar essay might not be so self-evident to your readers. And so you want to sort of like think about what it is that you need to better contextualize or sort of set up for them so that they're able to sort of engage with the essay on its own terms, apart from that sort of framework in which you were developing it in a seminar. And so that might mean, sort of really rethinking the conceptual, historical, and scholarly framework, and also conducting research beyond, right, the research you've already conducted for the purpose of submitting that essay in the context of a graduate seminar, to really sure that you've sort of like dotted your I's and crossed your T's. The last thing I'll just say on this subject too is that you also want to really think carefully about the aspects of the essay, as I was saying before, that seem self-evident. And a really big, important one to my mind in this context is framing the research question so that it's appropriate for the readership of the journal or the problem that you're sort of investigating. And also really, really thinking about the inclusions and exclusions of your primary source archive and your secondary scholarly apparatus. These are the kinds of things that are really important to sort of make sure you fully fleshed out before you submit the piece for consideration. The introduction is critical. Every aspect of the essay is critical, of course. Readers will read the whole essay when it goes out for review, but the introduction is particularly crucial because it sets the scene. And so I wanted to also talk a little bit about what kind of work you want to spend some time doing in the introduction. You have to do a range of things, and there's a lot of juggling in the process, right? You want to grab your reader's attention. You want to make sure that you frame your primary source archive such that the reader can see, why it is that you're thinking about these texts together, right? Or this text in this context. You want to make sure you articulate a key research question, not necessarily in the form of a question, but rather, you just want to make sure that the essay is sort of like identifying a compelling problem that's like worth taking seriously in the context of ongoing scholarly debate. You want to sketch the contours of those debates while also keep distinguishing your voice. That too is a kind of like juggling act. You want to make sure you articulate your argument with force and with clarity. And you also want to really make sure that the payoff or the sort of intervention of the essay is really clear. And something that I wanted to stress is that new readings are important. Some journals are moving away from publishing new readings. And I also think that sometimes framing your intervention as a new reading very often overlooks actually some of the other work that you may be doing. You might be undercutting actually the purchase of your own work. And so really thinking carefully about how can you frame what you're doing in the context of this article that isn't just a new reading, but is also sort of taking seriously the broader implications of that reading for ongoing debates in the field. This section of the essay is probably the most worth rewriting again and again and again. It's like the worst. I hate working on introductions, but it's very well worth your time. And I gestured a couple of times to posing a research problem with implications for the field. I just wanted to mention that again. And just to give you a kind of concrete example, I remember like working on my Tennyson chapter, and the way that chapter started was me framing it as a new reading. There's a certain sort of like line of thought around the discourse of extinction and in memoriam, and I have like a different take on that. And then the question, though, in terms of problem posing and sort of making the essay speak beyond this sort of like frame of a new reading is how can you scale that up to sort of engage broader debates in the field. I have some other sort of like scattered tips that I'm happy to expand on in Q&A. One is it's important to develop a scholarly framework that showcases a good balance between current and foundational criticism and theory. You want to make sure you're doing both. You do want to demonstrate you've done your homework, but you also, this is so important, you really want to be sure that you're engaging a version of the field that currently exists. This is something that some folks sometimes struggle with. This is really, really important. It's also important to sort of efficiently but evocatively describe the texts you're working with and why, particularly if they are lesser known texts. So, you can always assume like a kind of informed readership, but you also want to make ethical moves that invite readers in and help them follow the work that you're doing and appreciate the sort of text that you're working with. So that means defining key terms succinctly, but, substantively. And I mentioned introducing your texts. The same goes for introducing your texts. Something I always like to remind people of is that a brief description of a text can actually be an argument in and of itself because you are prioritizing, right, what to say about that text and how to contextualize it. And so there's a lot of work that can be done just in a kind of brief description of here's the thing I'm looking at and here's what it looks like if you're not familiar with it. The use of subheadings can be extraordinarily helpful as you're organizing a publishable essay, both for you as you're drafting and also for readers. There's also a balance. You don't want so many subheadings that you sort of split the essay up into pieces, right? That don't really cohere. So there's a sort of balance to be struck there, but subheadings can be really useful. Another thing I also emphasize over and over again in my comments when I'm working with authors is craft argumentative, not descriptive topic sentences. This is so important. I often see topic sentences that are contextual or descriptive, right? So they'll sort of like introduce some context with respect to the text. And by the end of the paragraph, we've articulated the claim. You want to preview that claim at the beginning of the paragraph, then work in the context. That will keep your reader with you. And it also it's a way of mapping the moves that you're making and how they relate back to the core argument. And it's just a good way of keeping the reader on track. It's good to quote judiciously. You want to make sure the evidence that you're sort of working with is well chosen. It's important to consider, you need to say something. You don't want to get defensive. But if there's obvious counter evidence, it might be worth your while substantively but efficiently to sort of address that counter evidence or counter readings. Striking a balance between quotation and the exercise of your own voice is really important. Something I also see sometimes is that people's voices slip into the critics that they're quoting. And so you really want to make sure that doesn't happen, particularly in topic sentences and particularly at the end of a key paragraph. Almost through my list, I think. Another thing that's helpful is to sort of ensure that you've defined the contribution and intervention such that they remain distinctly yours. This is where the use of I can come in handy, but you don't want to overdo it. So like everything else, there's a kind of balance here. The use of I is a really great way at super key moments in the essay for you to kind of foreground your voice and your argument and to really sort of stake that claim. If you overdo it though, right, it loses its force and its power. And so you want to use that move selectively at the moments when it will really pay off. Second to last thing is to the degree that you can, you want to signal to your readers what the essay will do. You also don't want to meta-commentate on it such that the reader gets impatient, because they feel as though you're talking more about what the essay will do than just doing it. So that's another sort of balance to strike. You want to signpost so your reader knows what to expect, but also just make sure you do the thing, just do the thing, and don't feel the need to sort of keep sort of commentating on what you're about to do. And last but not least, and I think this will segue nicely into some of the other points for discussion, really consider carefully the question of audience and fit with respect to the journal. So how you frame that problem posing or that research question is really important. It's an audience question, right? Think about who reads the journal and what kinds of debates they're engaged with and prepared to sort of think through and interested in. And so make sure you're considering your audience there. And also think too about maybe you're also doing some work that this audience might not be so familiar with or something, in which case it's that much more important to signpost the sort of moves or things that you're doing in the essay that might not, again, be so self-evident or obvious to the readers of the particular journal to which you're submitting. So that's what I have for now.
Thank you so much. It was really, really, really interesting. So, just a quick reminder that we are going to be reading all the questions here on the chat and we are going to have at the end of it. So, next one is going to be Catherine. So, please welcome her.
Thank you, Devin. I felt like I just nodded the whole time you were talking, and you've set me up beautifully to turn our attention to the submission process. So, When you submit your article to a journal, an editor is going to read it first to decide whether it should move on to peer reviewers. And there are a few reasons why an editor might not move it on to peer reviewers. So I want to give you some tips to help you avoid those roadblocks. Some of the reasons why you might get a desk rejection, which isn't the end of the world. It doesn't mean you can't submit again, but these are some of the reasons why your paper might get bounced back to you. The first, the subject matter. If it doesn't fit the journal's scope, we're not going to send it to reviewers. If it's too short, like maybe you've sent us a conference paper that you haven't adequately developed yet, or on the other hand, if it's too long, if you've sent us an unrevised dissertation chapter, we'll be sending that back to you as well. We can smell those a mile away. And I think we'll have to talk some more about that later, but nobody wants your unrevised dissertation chapter. If it is under-researched, so if the editor can see right off the bat that your work doesn't engage with relevant or the most recent scholarship in your field. And finally, if it doesn't follow the conventions of academic writing, which Devin just covered. If we think that readers would be too distracted by any of these problems to engage with your argument, we're not going to send it out, partly because we have to be really careful not to squander our reviewers' goodwill. Reviewers are people who are doing this work for free. We're so grateful to them. But we want to make sure, too, for your sake, that we're not sending your essay out unless it has a real chance of being accepted. So the tips that I want to give you today are to help you pitch your best work to the right journal so that you can get swiftly through along to the peer review process and get feedback from experts. So the way to do that, I think, or the best advice I can give you is to get to know the journal. And the only way to really do that is to look through past issues. So you need to know about the journal's scope, its audience, and also the kinds of research that it typically publishes. So to know whether your work falls under the journal's purview, you need to consider, like, some of these things are obvious, right? Like, does it have certain limits, say, for the time period it covers? Does it only do Victorian literature? Does it stretch into the long 19th century? Is it limited to some geographical region? Is it only British? Does it welcome transatlantic or transnational or transcolonial connections? You need to consider whether the journal favors certain critical methodologies. Does it tend to publish historical or archival research, formalist, author-driven, maybe data-driven studies? If you're submitting to a really specialized journal, you want to make sure that your topic addresses its interests. So, for example, right, you wouldn't submit your essay on Middlemarch to Victorian poetry, right? And in the same way, if you're submitting to Victorian periodicals review, your essay really needs to address or say something about periodicals themselves, not just the material that you can mine from a periodical. And on the flip side, if your article is on a really niche topic, you have to demonstrate its broader significance to this specific journal's audience. So Devin just talked about new readings of authors' works, right? But if you're doing a new reading of author X's work, that will be interesting to scholars of author X, but you need to think about the rest of us. What do we get out of the argument? How does this speak to broader scholarly debates or concerns? You also want to know, and this is really important, I think, has this journal published on your topic in the last few years? Because if so, you really need to take account of those arguments. When you submit to a journal, you're basically asking to contribute to an ongoing conversation, right? The people who come and read this journal, right, they are up to date with what's been happening here. And you need to show that you know what's been happening here too, right? So that you can add this new thing. I'm not suggesting that you have to suck up to the journal like by citing its publications, right? That's not it at all. And I also don't mean to suggest that you have to fall in line with what's already been said. You should do something innovative, right? I mean, if you're doing something different, that's really exciting. That's going to catch the editor's eye. But you have to make your work speak to what this community already knows, whether that's acknowledging the conversation that's happened or being aware that this conversation has not been happening, right? Of course, you also need to follow the submission guidelines, right? That's the first way you get to know the journal. And so I'll say if there's a style sheet, use it, right? I mean, that just makes editors happy. Why put a bunch of red flags on your work, right? Um, Outside of any specific guidance from the journal you're submitting to, I think some good rule of thumb stuff here is one, typical length of an article is about 5,000 to 9,000 words. That includes your notes and your bibliography. Um, Make sure that your document is readable. That means like Times New Roman 12. This is not the time to trot out your favorite font. All of us, our eyes, I mean, I think we're all wearing glasses today, we editors, and our readers are in the same boat. I mean, we're grizzled, we're half blind from the work we do. Make your document easy on all of us. So Times New Roman 12. Double space your work. I say that, and I always think, oh, people know this, but I also know that I receive a lot of things that are so tight. I feel bad sending it to readers in this condition. 1 inch margins. Keep your formatting simple. Make this easy to read. Remove your name and any identifying. Probably know they shouldn't put their name at the top of the essay or up in the page number. But another place where you might accidentally like reveal your identity is in acknowledgments, or if you've added something like this research was funded by the whatever have you prize. Those kinds of details, you'll absolutely want to include that for publication. Not such a great idea to include them on the submission because that might tell readers who you are. And then finally, I mean, you should be submitting your own original work. And in the humanities, I think we generally agree original work means not created with AI. It should not have been published in any form anywhere else. And then finally, like the most important part, it should not be under submission elsewhere. Multiple submissions, this is like one of the biggest no-nos. And I can tell you, like from the editor's perspective, the thing that really stings if we find out that you have submitted your essay to more than one journal is that you've wasted our time and resources, which are so precious. We are all doing this work for free. Everybody's so busy. And if we invest the time, the editor plus 2 readers, sometimes there are submission editors in between, that's a lot of people putting in hours of work to assess your submission. And then if you come back to us somewhere in that process and say, oh, never mind, I've been accepted elsewhere. One, we are deflated because we've missed a chance maybe to publish you, but also, gosh, all that time could have been spent on something else. There is no quicker way to ruin your reputation in academia than by double submitting your paper. If you get rejected, by all means, like work it over, send it out again, but one at a time, right? One submission at a time. Most journals will ask you to include an abstract. Since the abstract usually appears right above the essay, it's really not helpful to just copy and paste from your intro. I think once upon a time when abstracts only appeared, say, in the database that you were searching, that was fine. But now it's sort of, it is a little meta commentary on the thing that sits below it. You get 3 pages to develop an introduction thereabouts, right? You have 100 words for this abstract. And whether or not, even if the journal doesn't ask you to include this with the submission, it's a really good idea to include one because this is another chance to make your case, to say, look how interesting this is. So what your abstract should do, it should concisely summarize context for your argument, the problem or question that you're trying to address, your thesis, the approach you're taking, and its significance. And I know that sounds like a lot in 100 words, and give or take, you can move those parts around, but it kind of looks something like this. Critics have long argued, blah, 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 or we tend to think blank about blank, but problem or question. Using a blank approach or by examining this or that, this essay argues, demonstrates blank. Ultimately, these findings lead to some larger payoff, some bigger insight. There are a lot of ways to do this, right? I strongly recommend that you go read some abstracts, preferably in the journal that you're submitting to. Look at some examples to see how this is handled. But also, there's a great book to help you not only with the problem posing that happens in an abstract, but also the kind of work you do in an intro and a conclusion to the whole essay. I'll put the details in the chat, but the book is called Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace. This has been around for a long time, and the latest edition just came out in 2021. But Chapter 7, Framing Documents, it's a lifesaver. Okay, so I'm wrapping up. If you are still in the early stages of writing your essay, it's really helpful to draft with that specific audience in mind. Right, think about where your work might find a home and start looking at those journals now in advance so that you can bake this into the drafting process. But being realistic, it's often the case that you are revising something you've already written and trying to pitch it to a new venue, right? Either way, writing with that specific audience in mind, it's going to help your chances of advancing through to the peer review process. So I am going to turn it over to Jan now, who's going to share her wisdom about navigating readers' reports and the publication process. And I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine and Devin, for your remarks. Very helpful. And thank you to RSVP for hosting this session. So I'm going to talk a little bit about peer review, what it is. Probably we all know what it is, but I'm just going to describe it again, and a little bit about how it works. Before I begin, I just want to give a shout out to a really good website/blog by an academic coach named Jo Van Every. Her website is called Transforming Academic Lives. She has a lot of good material on peer review, and many other things. And I'll put the link in the chat later. A lot of the things are just on there for free. She does have some services that she offers as well. I think she's really great. So shout out to Jo Van Every. Anyway, so what is peer review? What is peer review? Academic journals and presses will send your manuscript to usually 2 anonymous reviewers who will read and comment on your submission. As far as I'm aware, I think most journals still practice double anonymous peer review, where the author doesn't know the identity of the peer reviewers and vice versa, because you have, as Kathy mentioned, you have taken your name off your manuscript. Formerly, this was called blind or double-blind review, but we no longer use this ableist term. We call it anonymous review or double anonymous review. Your peer reviewers will be other experts in your field. They may be some of the people that you cite in your bibliography. And then the editor uses the peer reviews to make decisions about whether to publish, and they pass on the reviewer's valuable feedback to the author. As a system, double anonymous peer review is not perfect. And I think there are some new models of peer review that are emerging. But peer review is crucial to the advancement of knowledge. And participating in peer review ensures that scholarly values play an important role in publishing decisions. And when it's done well, peer review provides crucial editorial feedback that improves the quality of knowledge and gives you a huge leg up. Peer review, finally, also protects academic freedom. It keeps scholars at the forefront of decision making and gives us freedom from commercial and political influence. So that's what peer review is in a nutshell, but how does it work? Peer reviews will come back to you as a set of comments and a recommendation to the editor to do one of several things. Accept, these are the standard types of recommendations. Accept with revisions, revise and resubmit, or reject. The first 2, accept and accept with revisions, are, of course, what everyone longs for. And if you get one of these, congratulations, and more on that in a minute. But revise and resubmit, this one is a little bit trickier. You need to take a revise and resubmit seriously. Peer reviewers and editorial boards, as Devin and Kathy have both mentioned, we spend a lot of time reading your essay, commenting, deliberating. You don't owe anything to anyone, but if you have gotten quality feedback from your reviewers, with actionable editorial advice, it's really worth your while to take advantage of this feedback, to revise, and yes, do actually resubmit. When you resubmit, provide a summary of your revisions in a separate document. And like I just want to, reiterate that revise and resubmit it's not just a sort of a more polite way of saying reject. It is saying we see potential here, but the essay isn't quite ready for prime time, but here are some ways to get you there, help get you there. Even if your essay is accepted, your manuscript will probably be returned to you with editorial comments from the peer reviewers or the editorial board or both. You need to take the time to read the comments, decide what to do with them, and revise. This is a standard part of the publishing process. And what are you going to be doing when you're revising? You may be doing more reading and research. You may be restructuring your essay, moving chunks around. You may be reanalyzing some of your primary material. You may be adding to your scholarly apparatus. And almost always, you will be working on clarifying the things in your essay that are interesting to your readers but remain somewhat opaque. And having to revise, whether it's an accept with revision or if you get an accept with revisions, having to revise doesn't mean that your initial submission was somehow weak or that your essay isn't worth being published. Somehow it is worth being published. It doesn't mean you're not a good writer or researcher. Being edited is part of the scholarly process, and revision is absolutely, standard, typical. So that's some things about revise and resubmit and accept with revisions. I want to talk a little bit about when you get a rejection. This is the thing we all dread, including the editor. The editor also dreads rejection. And Kathy has already outlined some of the ways to avoid a desk rejection. But if your essay has been sent out for peer review, but was rejected by both reviewers, or maybe it was a revise and resubmit from one reviewer, a reject from the other reviewer, and the editorial board sort of sided with the reviewer who recommended to reject. How to deal with this? First of all, it's totally okay to feel upset, and you don't have to pretend to be chill. Please know that you are not alone. We have all been there. Crying in the shower was something that I did, more than once. Take a deep breath. Do the self-care things you usually do. Talk to your friends and mentors. And when you feel ready for this kind of, taking a step back kind of self-talk, remind yourself that someone with expertise in your field took the time to read your work carefully and write comments. And this is a very good and valuable thing. Remind yourself that the purpose of peer review is to improve scholarship. The reviewers are specialists in your field, and they're giving you free advice that will very likely improve your work. So it's very, very wise to take the comments of your peer reviewers seriously after you have, healed somewhat from the rejection. Taking it seriously doesn't mean you have to do everything they suggest. You might encounter conflicting advice from the peer reviewers, which can be tricky. And that's where sometimes asking an editor to help you kind of navigate some of the conflicting peer review can be helpful. At this stage, you need to use your judgment to figure out how the peer reviews might improve your particular article and your scholarship in general. And it means continuing to work and figuring out where to send the article next. What's another journal what was the second journal on your list when you were doing your research to figure out what would be a good fit? Go back to that website, go back to that journal, research it again, and retool. Sometimes I think one of the reasons people are a little bit nervous about peer review is because they're scared they'll get cruel or nasty comments, mean comments from anonymous peer reviewers. This is actually, I think, more rare than we fear. It's rare that malicious and abusive comments will get past an editorial board. They do not get past my editorial board, for example. Most journals do not want to work with peer reviewers who are harsh or unfair to prospective authors. If you do get an abusive peer review, please realize that it's about them and not about you. It may also be that the submissions process is sort of automated without a lot of human oversight, and people aren't, being careful. That's not our experience at Victorian Review. We do everything. Humans do everything, and we don't let nasty comments go back to the authors. So, last thing I'll say is just a little bit about time. Writing and publishing is a collaborative process, and peer review is a slow process. Sorry. Most journals will take at least 3 months to get back to you. It's okay to ask a journal editor about the typical turnaround time, and if it is taking much longer than 3 months to hear back, it is absolutely fine to write to the editor to ask where things are at. Why is it so slow? I think Kathy, and maybe Devin also, both spoke to this. Editors often have a lot of trouble finding peer reviewers in the first place. Everyone is busy, everyone is overextended. Peer reviewers may take a lot of time. They don't always observe deadlines. Or sometimes they say yes, and then they ghost us, which is like, don't ever do that. It may also be the case that an editorial board, after the peer reviews come in, the editorial board needs to gather to review both your manuscript and the peer reviews before getting back to you. That also takes time. Once you are accepted and you have a set of revisions or copy edits in front of you, please prioritize that work. Sometimes one contributor who is behind on their revisions or proofreading can delay publication time for everyone else, for the editors, for the other contributors, etc. Please don't be that contributor. Bottom line about peer review is that it helps strengthen your scholarship. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid to ask lots of questions of journal editors about how it works. We want to hear from you. And that's all I'm going to say. I hope this panel has been helpful and encouraging to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here also and sharing your perspective on what makes submission effective and how emerging scholars can navigate this process with confidence. And especially the last part when you were talking about also, Jen, is about rejection and all these things. It's like, yeah, we are all humans at the end, so we all feel the same way. And sometimes we try to pretend that everything is okay, but we have a lot of things to share, and also it's good to have like this support group as well here. So I would like to know if somebody wants to start with the questions. If not, I think Gillian and I, we have questions, so we're going to let anybody else to unmute themselves.
I do see a question in the chat about cover letters, which I could attempt to answer, and then Kathy and Jan, I'm sure you have smarter things to say or something. That's a great question. So someone was asking about what, in cases where you're asked to provide a cover letter up front, like upon first submission. This is more, I think, routine or encouraged when you are submitting a revision, right, for a revise and resubmit. But if you're asked to do this up front, the way that I've approached these in the past, just personally, when I'm submitting my own work, is just I keep it brief, right? It doesn't need to be very long. And I usually sort of just, you state the title of your essay, that you're, pleased to submit it for consideration, and, you're grateful for the journal's consideration. And you might, offer a couple of sentences, not a full abstract, like about the essay, right? And so again, the importance of developing different language, which will serve you well, as I was saying in the chat. If the more you can get into the practice of that, the better it serves you in a bunch of different contexts, not just submitting journal articles. But I think keeping it short and sweet, and just like introducing yourself, saying a little bit about the essay, thanking the journal editor for their consideration, and then, offering to provide any additional information should it be needed, is like a good approach. I don't know if Kathy and Jan, you have anything you want to add.
think you've covered it pretty well. I mean, most of we don't ask for a separate cover letter, but I will say it's weird if you get an email with the attachments and no message in the email. That happens sometimes. So think about the email message as your cover letter. I'm submitting this thing with this title for consideration, right? One third piece of info, and I recognize this might feel there might be more than one way of looking at it, but if you're using like a Gmail account, right? And there's no signature that indicates like where you come from, right? Like where are you in the world? Um, I will sometimes have to do a little research on the person submitting because what I don't want to do is reach out, say, to your dissertation advisor and say, hey, we've got this submission. Will you review it for us? Right? This is sort of a waste of time. It helps to know if you are affiliated with an institution so that I don't ask your colleagues or teachers to review your work, right? On the other hand, like I get you want to sort of stand alone maybe or not indicate your affiliation. But if you're not trying to hide that, it might be a good idea to indicate that in the cover letter.
Yeah, I think so too, especially like, and it doesn't mean, that um, whether if you're finished your grad studies, even if you're not affiliated anywhere at the moment, it's helpful to know some of your institutional affiliation. One of the reasons being because of AI, actually. We want to make sure that human beings are submitting their work to us and that we're not, conversing with bots, frankly. So that's one of the reasons to, not that you have to tell your life story, but just one sentence about sort of who you are, where you're at is helpful. Also, if you're submitting something that's not conforming to the style that is like your essays in Chicago and we do MLA, just put a little note saying, I realize this is in Chicago. I can fix this. I will do this later. Just didn't have time, whatever. Like, just indicate that you're aware that there's a style guide that the journal follows.
Yeah, I also thought of one other thing. If you are institutionally affiliated, you can always put your letter on letterhead, which, just like looks nice. And then I don't know if folks are wondering about this, but just since we're talking about cover letters, there's more to say. I'll keep it brief. When you are submitting a revised essay, you've received an R&R and you're submitting the revision. I personally think it's very wise, even if not required or requested, to write a letter to the editor that outlines the work that you have done. For a number of reasons. It's a good way to advocate for yourself, right? And to sort of like demonstrate the ways that you've taken seriously the feedback that you've received. Also, tonally, if you can perform that sincerely, right? Not just a performance. If you can like signal a generosity of tone towards the feedback received, gratitude for it, and really sort of like map the ways that you've taken that into account. That is a very good and wise thing to do, even if you are not explicitly asked to do it. And just so folks know, those letters usually stay with editors. They don't go, at least in my case, like I don't send them out, like with a revised essay to the readers in question. But it's a smart thing to do. And then depending on how the process unfolds, it's just a good way to sort of like endear yourself to the editor and demonstrate that you are appreciative of and engaged with the process.
Reviewers for very niche subjects or a topic where there aren't any obvious experts in the field.
I can tell you a little bit about how I approach this. I mean, I try to generally get readers who cover different, sort of frames of expertise when finding readers in general. In cases where you might be working on a really, really sort of niche text, for example, I'll be like looking closely at the sort of conceptual apparatus at stake in the essay, right? So, for example, if you're like working in trans studies or something, right, like I will sort of prioritize that in terms of a reader that I might seek. If you're engaged with a particular set of like problems with respect to historicist inquiry, right, like that is something that I'll prioritize too. So it's a great question because asking that kind of question while you're writing your essay can help you figure out how to sort of like frame and highlight the work that you're doing. And again, to your point, right, like caring about something that no one's talked about is important, right? Everybody loves a new text. But this is a great example, actually, too, of what it means to sort of say, like, well, you might not know about this text or really care about it. How can I frame my argument and the interventions that I'm staging such that they're broader than simply, I found a new thing?
We have another one that is, what is the difference between the editorial board and your reviewers? Are they one in the same, or is the board more of a governance body?
I can answer that. The reviewers are usually peer reviewers are usually completely separate from the journal. They're not on the editorial board. The editorial board is more, there's usually an editorial board and an advisory board. The editorial board is the group of people who includes the editor. I have a submissions editor, and then we have a few members at large. We have a copy editor. We have a social media person. We're the ones who kind of make the final publishing decisions. And we use the peer reviews to help us make those decisions. The advisory board is a kind of a list of luminaries in the field who, at Victorian Review, they're involved to the extent that they often adjudicate our prizes. Sometimes I will reach out to some of them to like, hey, I've got this kind of ethical conundrum. What would you do about that? They're very distantly involved, but they give a journal a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They give a journal a kind of they signal a journal's stature, I suppose, and it just gives us a little bit of scholarly ballast to have an advisory board on our masthead. So yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
I think it depends. This does differ from journal to journal. The the board that Jan's describing, I have heard another phrase, the list of luminaries, right? Sometimes that's like window dressing. And I think maybe we used to have that model at VPR. Our editorial board or advisory board is a working board. So in our case, we have the editor, right? I have an associate editor who oversees book reviews. We have submissions editors who help with the peer review process. So if I don't oversee it myself, I send it to one of them, and they search for the expert reviewers and are often the third voice in that report. But our editorial board or advisory board consists of people who have established themselves in our field and who agree to review up to a certain number of essays per year. So for us, this kind of answers another question that's in the chat about how do you find reviewers for things where there's no obvious expert? The people on our advisory board have demonstrated like their ability in a lot of ways. And so when we have a thing and we don't know who to send it to, they are there. There are dependable folks who can look at a thing and offer us advice. So they're actual like working reviewers for us, but we observe all the same rules of the double anonymous peer review with them.
Going with that one here says, just to clarify, if you want to check the details of comments, revisions offered by reviewers, should you do that through the editor and thereby retain anonymity, or it is even ever acceptable to approach reviewers directly? Oh, Devin, you already responded there, also in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can see that there's a question a little bit earlier from Hazel, who said Devin spoke about being careful to not overly quote from primary sources, but what are general feelings re illustrations and presentation of information in tables, etc.? So I think they're asking about illustrations, information in tables. What are feelings about that? So if anyone could jump in on that, that would be great, because I think she's a bit earlier on.
It's fine. We publish a lot of articles with illustrations, not so much tables, this is like humanities, like, come on. But we publish a lot of illustrations, and one thing to be really mindful of is that illustrations take a long time, like at the production stage, often because, well, they take a long time only if you haven't looked at the specs on the website, which describe what the format of your illustration needs to be, what the DPI number is, can it be a JPEG? Can it be a this or that? And also, have you looked into what the permission, what are the copyright issues here? Do you need to arrange for permission from the British Library, which takes forever and ever? How much does it cost? You're going to have to absorb the costs of the you're going to have to absorb the print costs or the reproduction costs if the image is still under copyright. And if you don't do that stuff ahead of time, and then find, oh, geez, there's this whole other angle here that can really slow down the production time. So just make sure that you know kind of what you're getting into.
I could also just clarify super quick the quotation thing. I'm a dense quoter, like I'm known for this, so I just want to say. But what I mean by quoting judiciously is that if you block quote, you need the block quote in full, right? For example, right? Quoting judiciously as in, right, you're really working with the material that you're quoting. You don't allow quotations to stand in as self-evident in and of themselves, and you don't fall back on them as a way of sort of like deferring, or sort of like not exercising your own voice. That's what I mean. So just so that people aren't confused or something, just being really deliberate about when you quote and working fully with the material that you do quote.
I have a question too that will be uh, from your perspective. I lost my question. Sorry, give me a second. There it goes. How do you recommend authors approach conflicting reviewer reports, especially when the advice points in different directions?
Um, that's a really good question. I mean, you're never, as I said in my remarks, you're never ever obligated to kind of do everything the peer reviewer tells you. They have a particular kind of angle on what they think you're trying to do. They might be, they might not be going in the direction that you want to be going. Um, I think if you get conflicting advice, it's good to share it maybe with someone else, even maybe the editor, maybe someone else in your field who's not, maybe your dissertation supervisor or a colleague or something like that, who can kind of work through, kind of like translate some of the advice with you and kind of help you map out what you want to do. I mean, it's your work, right? It's not anyone else's work. So it's at that stage of the process, you really need to kind of use your judgment to figure out what is the advice that kind of makes the most sense, that aligns with the direction that I really want to be taking this in. Sometimes reviewers will make suggestions that are like, they've made that suggestion because that's something they happen to know a lot about and they think it's relevant, and it might be relevant, but it might be relevant only to the extent that it can be a footnote. You don't have to necessarily go and make that a whole new dimension of your essay. So yeah, like taking the time to really read carefully the comments and really think hard about like what is useful and constructive for you, and what can just be set aside, because not all of it has to be attended to.
I think often, I mean, and this sort of is to the side of your question, but often when we get reader reports that are conflicting in that way, the editor is going to give you some sort of guidance, right? Like I'll acknowledge, it looks like they're seeing two very different things here. With VPR, a lot of the time when they're so divergent, it's because the article maybe is a little flimsy on the periodicals theory, right? And so we'll have one reviewer who's giving lots of advice about here's how you make this speak to periodicals more solidly, and somebody else who's saying this isn't a good fit for VPR at all, and you do this and send it somewhere else, right? So if it's diverging in that way, it's very easy for me to say, like, look, you've got choices to make if you are going to resubmit to us, really listen to reader one, right? Or if I think that one of them seems like the quicker or like more efficient road to publication, I'll indicate that too. Reader one gives you a really clear path. If you go with reader two, then blah, 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 right? So I think you can often lean on the editor for this, but if the editor hasn't, this is one of those cases where you could absolutely email back and say, thank you so much. What do you think about these two reports, right? It is okay to ask. I don't think we'd ever be upset to have to follow up on that.
That's absolutely correct. When I was a grad student, I felt so terrified of editors and publishers, and we don't have to be. This is our job to mentor new scholars, to, show you the ropes, to provide feedback. Like this is what we do. So, you can start the conversation anytime. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah, I just want to echo that point. I was afraid to approach editors, and we are here for this. This is like why we are here. And I also want to clarify something I said earlier that's going to haunt me about if I don't uh about when you resubmit your work that's been revised and that letter. What I mean by endearing yourself to the editor is not you try to become the editor's bestie and then somehow you'll have a better in. That's not how this works. Just to be clear, there's no favoritism, just to be clear. What I mean by that though is like, especially in cases of conflicting reports, that letter is a chance for you to model, right? The sort of like generosity with which you've engaged with feedback, and then also the intentionality with which you've decided, here are the things I'm going to take up, maybe per the editor's advice that's already been given to. And then here are the things I'm not, and I'm going to be really thoughtful as to explaining why.
Good. Thank you so much for all the responses. I have two more questions. What are some of your pet peeves when reading submissions or articles in general? Or what is something seemingly minor that impresses you when it appears in someone's writing?
Can I answer this? Right. I mean, I think we're all probably like jumping. Everybody's got a thing. I recommended a book earlier. I want to recommend it again. Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace. The number one thing that really sort of sinks our feelings about a submission is when the prose is written in so much jargon or in such circuitous sentences that it is tough to get the meaning. And we're all guilty of that, right, in academia. But I mean, I think that writing clear, active sentences is the number one skill we can all work on, and that will impress readers. And I give the example, right? The difference between saying John hit Bill, right? If I came running into the room and yelled, John hit Bill, you all will say, oh my goodness, right? You all know what I mean. And you can sometimes say like Bill was hit by John. This is fine. Especially if we don't know who John is and you just want to tell us Bill was hit, also fine. But it's really just so wearying to read manuscripts that instead say something like, the hitting of Bill was done by John. If you're doing a lot of nominalizing in your sentences, if you're talking about the hitting of Bill, stop and think about who is doing what in your sentences. Because the clearer you can make that, the happier your readers will be, the stronger your prose will be. It just goes a long way. And I say this because I have written that sentence in many ways, maybe not about Bill and John, but about a lot of other academic topics. I think it's really important to try to get the flab out of your writing.
I think one thing that we notice a lot is one thing we ask authors to do a lot when we ask them to revise is to work on their introduction. Devin talked about this. If we have to struggle to figure out like what's the key intervention, if you're still saying things on page 8 or 9, like in this essay, I will do this. If you haven't sort of described what the thing is, you're not to go on and on with plot summary or description, but if we don't actually know what you're talking about, it's obvious to you, it's not obvious to everybody else. All like the introduction is so all important. And not to say that the rest of it isn't, but that those first 3 pages are just so crucial. So I wouldn't call that a pet peeve exactly. It's just something that we see a lot of. We work with authors a lot both newer scholars and established veteran scholars on their introduction. I mean, come on, writing the argument, writing the thesis is the hardest thing. Like we all know that. It's terribly hard. I would say that one pet peeve that I have, though, is someone who kind of dismisses everything that's ever been written on this topic or this text or whatever as just kind of like irrelevant bullshit, and I'm kind of figuring out now, I'm going to state now what's wrong with what everyone. I find that I find that to be a pet peeve. Like I just kind of think, that can't be correct. That no one has said anything, of substance on this text. So yeah, I would avoid that move. Certainly, of course, you want to, if there's a stake to claim and if there's like there's a debate, you want to participate in it. But that doesn't mean, kind of trashing, like throwing other critics under the bus.
Thank you so much. We are almost already over the hour. We'll be already over the hour, and I would like to special thank to give it and also for all the insights and transparency. And there are some more more news. Our next DG event is going to be December 12th. So I can't wait to see you all there. And thank you so much for this amazing and so insightful day. Thank you. See you later.
Thank you.